Hey folks, and welcome back to the channel. Focus for today's video is going to be on sim racing PCs and specifically how to make the most of the budget that you have available when you're either building a PC from sim racing, so you're doing it DIY, or if you're buying a pre-built. The plan is to talk through each of the main PC components, and especially if you're building a system yourself. There's all sorts of areas that you can spend a ton of money, but over the years, as I've gone through a couple of upgrade cycles for my PC, I've come to realize that there's areas that you can spend a lot of money but not actually get a ton of benefit from a sim racing perspective. But then there's other components where it might be worth stretching the budget a little bit just to give you some longevity in the components so that the PC will last quite a long time. Now, a lot of this video will just be talking head. I will throw in some B-roll, but feel free to minimize me. The video shouldn't be too long. As I said, I'll chat through each of the core components, share some of my experiences on where I think it's worth spending a little bit more money, and more importantly, where you can save. But before we get into the individual PC components, let's just have a quick chat about the main platforms that are out there today, be it Intel or AMD, and we'll get started there. So when we're talking about platforms or chipsets, and this is important both if you are just buying a pre-built off the shelf, you'll often have a choice of Intel or AMD. Perhaps even more importantly, if you are doing a DIY build and you're building and buying all the components individually. The first major decision you've got to make is you're going to go with an Intel setup, an Intel chipset, motherboard, etc., or you're going to go AMD. And as I said in the intro, this isn't a comparison between the two. There's different reasons from picking different brands, but I just want to take you through some of the things you should think about before making that decision, just to make sure you are fully informed and just don't get swept away in any of the manufacturer advertising around specific motherboards or Intel or AMD, because ultimately you can buy either one of those brands and you can build a very strong PC around it and be perfectly happy from a sim racing perspective, but it always pays just to do a little bit of research as well. The first major decision when it comes to platform or chipset will be the generation. Are you looking for the absolute latest and greatest? If so, fantastic, but just know that will always carry a price premium, be it Intel or AMD. Or are you comfortable stepping back one generation, knowing that you're going to be able to get likely cheaper components, maybe better availability, but then the downside, of course, is you may get towards your next upgrade cycle a little bit quicker than if you're going with the absolute latest platform. But from a budget perspective, this is probably the most important decision. If you're going full enthusiast and money isn't so much of a big deal, great. Obviously, try and get the latest and greatest. Set yourself up for longevity and hopefully you can build a PC that's going to last you 3, 4, maybe even 5 years. But if cost is a factor, you're probably going to be able to get much more for your money if you just take one step back on the chipset generation. If you're looking at AMD, that means AM4. Now, really, that has reached kind of end of life, but you can still get fantastic processors for AM4. The 5800 X3D is a great example of a very strong prior generation CPU, which performs fantastically well with the 3D cache in sim racing games. It was my prior setup actually that I had before making my upgrade. And there's nothing wrong with DDR4 RAM, which will come with that chipset, and you can build a very, very strong PC that can handle iRacing and other things just fine today, and it won't limit you either in terms of the GPU that you want to plug into the system. So I think that's the key one initially on the budget front, is you can save a lot of money by jumping back a prior generation. However, of course, you don't have the latest and greatest. Your next upgrade cycle is going to come a little bit quicker, depending on the type of graphics configuration you want to run and how much you want to push your system. And the last one will be pre-built or build it yourself. Again, purely personal preference. Typically for a pre-built, you will pay a premium, consider that the labor, the decision making, the design, of the company putting the PC together for you. And so value for money wise, they're generally not as good as if you can build the PC yourself, but to build it yourself obviously takes time. You've got to do a bunch more research, and you've got to have, be willing to learn, how to put all the components together. If you've never built a PC before and you'd quite like to try, be a little bit nervous, don't want to buy a ton of gear and then make a mess of it, all I can tell you is in today's world with YouTube and the guides that are available, as long as you don't rush and you take your time, it's very, very accessible, to be honest. I always consider it kind of like adult Lego, and I love getting to a point where I need to refresh my system and I can do a rebuild because I just find the whole process super enjoyable. If you know what you're doing, you can probably get the build done in 2 to 4 hours, maybe quicker if you're really fast at it. And if it's your first time, you kind of just want to dedicate a day to it. Just take it slow, have YouTube up, follow the kind of instructions on a YouTuber or kind of any channel that you trust, and I find it a super rewarding process. But in reality, pre-built, DIY, doesn't really make a difference, but just bear in mind, if you are trying to stretch your budget, you're likely to get a little bit more for your money if you go down the DIY route than if you go for a pre-built off the shelf. So onto the motherboard. Now, of course, if you're buying a pre-built, this is set for you, so nothing really to worry about. But for anyone who's going to be building their own PC, once you've decided on the chipset and the platform that you want to go with, then you need to make the selection on the motherboard. And in short, this is the best component to waste money on. Motherboards back in the day, were typically $100 to $200, very reasonable for a very strong motherboard. Unfortunately now it has become a component where, especially at the high end, you can pay upwards of $1,000 USD, really for not a ton more performance. And generally those higher end boards are great when you're trying to overclock and push a system extremely hard. But in reality, for sim racing, some of the key components that you'll be looking at will be number of USB ports and things like that. And at the lower tier boards, you can often get just the same performance and as many ports as you need without paying this huge premium for the boards at the higher end. So be aware when selecting motherboards, there's tons of great marketing out there, but it's probably the best way to waste your budget from a sim racing perspective. Now that said, there are some components of a motherboard that you want to pay close attention to. First one is going to be USB ports. Almost all of our sim rigs are going to come with a ton of peripherals. Headset, pedals, wheelbase, you name it. You can easily get up with 6, 7, 8 USB cables that you need to plug in. And I always think it's best if you can plug them directly into the PC. There's always a ton of problems if you have a USB splitter, powered USB dock. I find that they just can introduce instability, stutters, unreliability with the system. So the one element to really pay close attention to on the motherboard is how many USB slots does it have, and then how many of those are you going to use. And if it doesn't have as many, it might be worth looking at the next tier up, depending on price of course, just to get access to more direct slots on the motherboard so that you don't have to be getting splitters or anything like that, just for stability and kind of long-term use of the system. RAM speed can be another one, or really just RAM compatibility. You've probably got an idea of the sticks of RAM that you want to run. Is it 2? Is it 4? Generally 2 is fine. A lot of motherboards will come with 4 slots, great, so that's future upgradability should you need it. I've almost always just used 2 sticks of RAM. Right now I use 2 times 16 gigabyte in 2 of the 4 slots. So this RAM compatibility is not usually a problem, but do double check. If you're selecting a motherboard, have a look at the RAM you're planning to buy at the same time and just ensure that it is compatible both ways, especially with the XMP or Expo profiles for AMD. These are the inbuilt overclocks that RAM kits come with. They're very well tested, so most people don't really consider them an overclock, but they are. And you want to make sure that your motherboard and CPU can run the speeds, the advertised speeds of the RAM. So just something to be aware of. Okay, let's quickfire through just a number of other elements that you'll see kind of branded or marketed on motherboards. Power phases. This is important if you're going to overclock, but if you're only doing a mild overclock or you're not planning to overclock at all, the power phases included in even the basic motherboards for whatever chipset you choose are going to be just fine because they will be more than capable at running the CPU and the RAM at the design speeds. So be careful. It's something that motherboard manufacturers like to push as, super stable power delivery, blah, blah, blah. Well, it's great if you're going to really push the system and overclock it, but if you're not, the standard power phases are going to be just fine. PCIe generations, and typically what you'll see in boards today will be 3, 4, and 5, with 5 being the latest. 4 is fine, would be my general guidance. The very latest generation of Intel and AMD processors will run PCIe 5. They really only come into play for speed for SSD drives at the moment, and only then if you're frequently moving significant amount of content from one SSD to another. So if you're a content creator, PCIe 5 might be really important for you, but if this is just a sim racing PC, again, you probably don't need to worry too much. Even PCIe Gen 3 is going to be fine. The SSDs will run slightly slower, but to be honest, it'll be unnoticeable when you're sim racing. But right now, a really good balance is PCIe 4. Speeds are great. They've got plenty of life in them in terms of bandwidth for future upgrades. And as I said, PCIe Gen 5 is being marketed, but purely from a sim racing PC perspective, isn't going to provide really any extra performance. And finally, on networking, LAN and Wi-Fi, this amazingly are areas that manufacturers are able to kind of push and talk about killer Wi-Fi and all of this gigabit, Ethernet, etc. The reality is you're more likely to be limited by the speed of your internet that's coming into the house than you are by the ports on modern machines. So it's probably not something you need to worry about. Obviously, running a LAN port over Wi-Fi is preferable. If you have to run Wi-Fi, if there's just no way to run an Ethernet cable to your PC, then of course Wi-Fi later generation should be a little bit more stable. But the reality is if you can run Ethernet, that's going to be better. And then even if you're only running Wi-Fi 5, I think the latest standard is Wi-Fi 7, but even if you're back on Wi-Fi 5, as long as you're somewhat close to the router, you should be fine. But if you are close to the router anyway, do your best to run an Ethernet cable. It's going to be a lot smoother. So in summary, for motherboards, it's an area to save. Only buy a motherboard which has what you need. Try not to get sucked into the higher end overclocking boards, the excess power delivery, etc. If it can run your CPU at the advertised speeds, if it can run the RAM when they're running at their Expo or XMP profiles, and it has sufficient USB ports for all of your peripherals, that's the board for you. And quite often you'll find that that is not a board that's at the top tier. It can be in the mid to low tier to give you the performance that you need. Onto the CPU. Now this, in reality, is probably the most critical component of PC. Pre-built or DIY, it doesn't matter. Any games that are really simulations take a lot of compute power and therefore the CPU is pushed pretty hard. I exclusively race on iRacing, and that is known to be particularly hard on the CPU, and it doesn't utilize a ton of cores, so most of the game is rendered through 1 or 2 cores, and therefore the speed of that CPU is going to make a really big difference. So the short answer to this one is this is where you want to try and spend a bit more budget to maybe get a higher end CPU for the chipset that you've purchased, just so that you can really get the most longevity out of your setup as you can. Now, having said that, the answer is not just buy the absolute best CPU that fits in your chipset. It is worth doing a little bit of research and just understanding how your particular sim titles that you run are going to utilize the CPU. I can talk about iRacing because I used it a lot. I don't need 15, 16, however many cores to get the most out of iRacing, and actually lower cores with a single CCD on the AMD platform tend to run a little bit smoother. So I currently run a 9800X3D, so yes, it is currently right up there in terms of the top processor. Previously, I was running the 5800X3D, which now is a couple of generations old, but it was a fantastic CPU in terms of what it provided. It had the extra cache, and this is really just an AMD thing for now. I'm not sure if Intel will go down that path in the future, but that extra cache lends itself to fantastic performance really in any sim racing titles or other simulators like flight sim, etc. And because it had a single CCD, it was a fairly simple setup. You know, it doesn't have tons of cores, but it has more than enough for what iRacing needs, and I could really squeeze a ton of performance out of that. So when you're choosing a CPU for your particular chipset, more cores may not be better for the simulation title you run, and that could be a way to just burn extra cash that you could be saving to put somewhere else, such as into a higher end GPU. So do the research in terms of how does your sim title use the CPU cores? You know, how many does it use on a regular basis? And if it's like iRacing and it's only really using a handful, 2, maybe 3 as the simulation's running, then just know the other cores are generally sitting idle. And if all you're doing is running a couple of overlays and a few other apps, it shouldn't mean that you need the absolute top end CPU with 16 cores for your chipset. So this can be a way to save a little bit of money just by making a smart decision in terms of what CPU to buy. But equally, you don't want to underfund this part of your build. You want to understand the requirements, what CPU is going to be best for your system, for the sim titles you run, and then really push the budget to achieve that. Obviously, you've got a choice between Intel or AMD. Now, I've stuck with AMD for the last 5 years. I've been pretty happy because obviously they've been on a bit of a tear and have now overhauled Intel in terms of ultimate performance for CPU. But there's nothing wrong with Intel processors either. They were the kings, for sim racing for a long time and for gaming in general, just because of the clock speeds that they could reach. Bear in mind that there have been some challenges with I think the 13th and the 14th gen Intel processors. So whether you're pre-built or building yourself, just be aware that there has been some instability issues. I'm not an expert on those, haven't run those processors personally, but check out Gamers Nexus and all the usual YouTubers in the CPU world. They do some great discussion and analysis on kind of some of the challenges around those. So just, be open-minded, and if a 13th or 14th gen Intel processor is in the mix for you, just make sure you do the research, you make sure it's the right choice. On the AMD front, everything has been relatively stable for some time. The AM4 platform, is very well tested now. There were some challenges around USB connections and audio challenges with that chipset early on, but they really have largely been resolved and were never an issue for me when I was running it. And then the current AM5 chipset, again, when they released, especially with the 7800X3D, there were some challenges with, I think, too much voltage causing some issues and potentially some burning actually with the CPUs. Again, that was resolved over 12 months ago, and it seems to be a pretty stable platform, even for the latest 9000 series processors. Haven't heard any disasters come through in the press on that one. So really, Intel or AMD, personal choice, but do the research into the different generations. As I said, if you step back a couple, if you were looking at Intel 12th gen, they were fantastic processors, really well reviewed, and you'll be able to get those at a great price today. 13th and 14th gen, just keep an eye on. And now if you're looking at AM5 processors for AMD, you're going to start paying a premium because they really are, the best processors for gaming at the moment. So you will have to dig a little deeper in your pocket to get the absolute latest and greatest on the AMD front at the moment. And lastly, onboard graphics. How important is that? You can usually get that as an option on processors on both AMD and Intel. My 5800X3D from a couple of generations ago did not have it. Didn't really miss it either, because of course you're not going to run the sim title off an onboard graphics from the CPU because it's fairly low power. But my 9800X3D does have it, and I think there's options on the Intel side as well. The one thing it can be really useful for is just diagnosing issues if you've got a GPU challenge, because if you don't have onboard graphics, then if your graphics card kaputs, basically you can't get any display feed from your PC. So it's not really a deal breaker, and if it's going to increase cost, it's of course not going to give you any real value when you're sim racing. But it's quite useful as a diagnosis tool, or if you're, say, running a fourth screen and you don't want to plug that fourth monitor directly into the external GPU, you could plug it into the onboard graphics instead, just to kind of split that load away. So it's useful. I like having it. I don't actually currently use mine at the moment, but I do like it as an option, especially, as I said, if the GPU went kaput, I know I could still use the PC and do some diagnosis of it as well. So in summary, for the CPU, it is an area to spend, but you don't need the absolute best of the best to have a fantastic CPU for sim racing. And sometimes, as I said, more cores doesn't mean better gaming. Sometimes on the AMD side, having multiple CCDs, which comes with a higher core count, can actually negatively impact the game or the sim racing, or at least take a bit more setup to get it running as smoothly as it should be. So spend where it makes sense, but the key thing for this one is do the research to understand how the sim titles you run will use the cores that are available on your CPU. CPU coolers really just tend to be platform and chipset dependent on whether you need to spend more or less money in this space. If you are running Intel, probably 12th, 13th, 14th gen, maybe even some earlier gens to that, they generally aren't super power efficient, generate quite a bit of heat, so you might need an AIO or at least a very beefy air cooler in order to keep the temps down to get the maximum performance. You know, the one thing that you do not want in any gaming, but especially sim racing that pushes a CPU hard, is to be throttled by temperature. So if you know your CPU is power hungry, generates a lot of heat, then don't skimp in this area, because you'll get that throttling, and not only will that limit performance whilst you're gaming and whilst you're in the sim, but it might also induce stutters as it's kind of bouncing off a temperature limit. So if you know your CPU is power hungry, make sure you've got adequate cooling for it. Now on the flip side, if you're running AMD or any CPU that you know is power efficient, doesn't generate a ton of heat even when it's being pushed hard on a couple of cores, then this is an easy place to save money. You don't need a 360 AIO to keep the latest AMD CPUs cool. You see in my system I have one. It's purely from an enthusiast perspective and a look perspective. It absolutely is not needed to run the CPU at the specs that I have it at, even as it's currently overclocked. So it really just depends on the CPU that you're running. So be aware, it's easy to spend hundreds of dollars in this space that is unnecessary. If you're going enthusiast like me, great, knock yourself out. It's kind of fun. I do like how CPU coolers can look, especially the AIOs in cases. But equally, I could have on here a fairly small air cooler for my 9800 X3D, and it would run just fine. So if you're Intel, and if it's generating a lot of heat for the CPU, be careful, make sure you've got adequate cooling, because you absolutely don't want to temperature throttle when you're gaming. But equally, if you've got an efficient CPU, well, it's usually a great place to save money, and you can probably get away with just a highly efficient air cooler. Let's chat about the GPU, or the video card. This is honestly pretty simple. Spend as much as you can on this component. Unlike the CPU, where you can have too many cores and they don't actually provide any extra benefit for the extra money that you spend, on a video card, and this is especially true if you race in VR or if you have triple screens, more is always better. The CUDA cores, as I think they're called on NVIDIA, the more of those, the more graphics processing power you're going to have, then the better graphics you're going to be able to run, and what should happen is you should have therefore smoother gameplay at higher resolutions. So there's really no question, this along with the CPU is where you're likely going to spend the most money on the build, and on the GPU you just want to spend as much of the budget as you reasonably can to kind of get the top card for the setup that you're running. Now, if you're running a single screen, you don't need to be running a 4090, of course. So do look at your screen setup to make sure that, again, you're not spending money where you're not going to get the benefit. But like I said, if you're running triple screens in 1440p or like me in 4K and you're really maxing it out, then of course you're going to want as much GPU power as you can. If you're running triples in 1080p, it's less important. You know, a lot of the mid-tier cars will run that setup absolutely fantastically well. But again, if you do have a bit more budget to spend, getting a higher end GPU now will just help support future upgrade cycles when you change out your monitors and maybe you push that resolution, maybe you try VR out for a while. You know, as soon as you switch to VR, it's hugely demanding on the GPU. So the short answer here is for sure spend, but spend in the context of your monitors or VR setup just to make sure that, you know, you're getting the right GPU for the amount of pixels that you're running. A couple of elements of a video card to just take a look at, you know, other than price point, CUDA cores, etc. The amount of VRAM available is becoming more and more important as games are starting to use VRAM more and more. iRacing is no exception. You know, I would say the baseline today is probably 8 gigabytes of VRAM, and you can get that on the mid to lower tier cards. If you can, you know, getting in the 12 to 16 gigabyte range, fantastic. You know, that should do you well for, you know, a couple of upgrade cycles. Anything beyond that now is really in the enthusiast. The 4090 I think is running 24 gigabytes. I'm almost certain iRacing is not making full advantage of that. At most, I bet it's getting in the sort of 13, 14, 15 gigabytes of usage. But yeah, I would say nothing lower than 8 gigabyte for sim racing if you can make that work, you know, and if you can't, see if you can save money elsewhere on your build to free up a bit more cash to get to that 8 gigabytes of VRAM. And then, yeah, if you've got a bit more money available, looking at cards that have 12, fantastic. You know, generally these are still coming in at a fairly good price point, and then really anything above 12, great, you know, just good for future upgradability and longevity of your system. The final thing to think about here is the brand. There's probably 3, I think, main brands today. Intel, that are kind of the new kids on the block, but they've most recently had some big hits in the low to mid-tier range, and those mid-tier cards ought to run pretty well for sim racing titles. Obviously you have AMD, and then you kind of have the kings that'll be NVIDIA, or at least the kings at the top end today. Now, it shouldn't matter too much which brand you go for. Obviously, with Intel being a bit newer to the party, I would do some research to make sure that there hasn't been any compatibility issues with these newer Intel graphics cards with the sim titles that you run, so worth doing a bit of research. I exclusively run on iRacing, and I think NVIDIA and iRacing have traditionally played a little better than the AMD video cards, but I also think that, you know, that difference is not as big today as it used to be in the past. But the real key thing I would say that's important is what is the VRR, the variable refresh rate technology, which is in your monitors. Because if it is FreeSync, that's fine. There's no reason why you can't use an NVIDIA card and get the most out of it. But kind of check the compatibility, make sure that it is going to be compatible, because you don't want to have a video card that can't use the variable refresh rate technology that you have on your monitor. FreeSync is the AMD implementation, but it is open source, so NVIDIA GPUs can access that and take advantage of it as well. But if your monitor setup is G-Sync, then that is the NVIDIA technology. Now, when I switched to 4K triples, one of the things I did deliberately is to pick a monitor set which was G-Sync compatible, because my prior monitors were not. They had compatibility, but it wasn't official, and it never seemed like the variable refresh rate worked as well as it could. So I switched over to a set of Alienwares which are certified G-Sync compatible, and it's true, I do think the setup just works a little bit smoother with the NVIDIA software. They're identified automatically as G-Sync compatible, and the setup was pretty easy. So I would say when you're thinking about brands, really 2 things. 1, game compatibility, just do that double check from one brand to another with the sim titles you run. And then 2nd, what is the variable refresh rate technology that your monitors are running, and just make sure there's good compatibility with the video card that you choose. Onto memory or RAM for your system. Not tons to talk about here. It is easily a place that you can spend more money than you need to by pushing towards the top end of the RAM that's available, which is really designed for highly overclocked systems, so just something to be aware of. The first key decision might be whether to go DDR4 or DDR5 in terms of the generations. DDR5 is newer, has higher speeds, but brings with it a slightly increased cost. It's much better today than it was back in the early period of 2024. The prices are a lot more reasonable now. But DDR4 is even cheaper. So if you're building a prior generation build, such as AM4 or one of the earlier Intel platforms, you can get fantastic DDR4 RAM at very good prices, albeit the selection is a bit more limited today than it would have been 12 months ago. So in terms of what to look for, we talked about this earlier, but compatibility with motherboard and with CPU, that's obviously critical. And not just in terms of the overall capacity of the RAM, but making sure that the CPU and the motherboard can run the Expo or XMP overclock profiles for the RAM, just so you can get the absolute best performance from the RAM kit that you buy. Number of sticks doesn't matter. If your motherboard only has 2 slots, then of course you're going to be limited to 2. Most motherboards, especially in the mid to high tier, will have 4 slots. And generally I've only ever run 2, to be honest. I think that is often the sweet spot in terms of speed and performance. But generally it's pretty simple. RAM kits are widely available. They typically are cross-compatible from Intel to AMD. However, those Expo and XMP profiles that I mentioned earlier, Expo is specific for AMD chipsets and XMP more so for Intel. So quite often RAM manufacturers will have similar kits, but one is for AMD, one is for Intel. So just do that double check. Don't get completely sucked in by the marketing and just grab the kit that you think is the best. Just make sure it has good compatibility with the chipset that you're running. One aspect that you'll hear about for RAM will be speed and timings. Higher speed, tighter timings, great. That's going to give you the best performance for your system. But a little bit like the motherboard itself, this is an easy way to go down the rabbit hole, because mid-tier RAM is usually perfectly fine and the performance is going to give you 95% of what you get from spending double the amount on a set of RAM sticks to just squeeze out slightly tighter timings or slightly higher speed. Now, I'm not as close to the Intel side of things, so I'm not going to comment on kind of the speeds to be looking for, but I know from an AMD perspective for DDR5, a RAM speed of 6,000 megatransfers per second is kind of the sweet spot, and CL30. And you can get those kits with those specifications at very reasonable prices today, which is awesome. 12 months ago, it was a different story, but you can really access those kits for good value. Now you can get tighter timings and you can get CL, I think 28, maybe even CL26 speed kits or timing kits, but the reality is the cost of those is going to be much, much higher, and you're going to see very little performance payback from a sim racing perspective. So again, just be careful to not get suckered in too much to the marketing to push you towards the top tier. Usually mid-tier RAM running at good speeds for your system that has compatible Expo or XMP profiles is all you're going to need for a fantastic, stable and fast running RAM for your sim racing system. Let's quickly touch on storage. So solid state drives, HDDs, hard drives, so the old spinning disks. I think, in today's world, you really want to be running everything gaming on an SSD, whether that's an NVMe drive that plugs directly into the motherboard, or whether it's a SATA SSD. Both work perfectly fine, and it'll just depend kind of what is the best setup for your system. But you can get very powerful SSD drives, high speed, latest gen, for good prices these days. Now, there is a couple of things to think about. The very latest iterations of SSD run on the PCIe 5 generation, but be a little aware of these drives. They're not going to really give you any benefit in terms of sim racing. They're useful for content creators when people are moving significant file sizes on a regular basis. It will increase transfer speed, etc. But these drives run hot. They often need an additional fan in the system in order to take that extra heat away. And as I said, they're very expensive today. So when I was building my current system, I kind of got sucked into the marketing around PCIe 5 SSDs. But once I dug in a little bit deeper, I realized there'd be absolute no real world benefit, but I'd pay double for the drive and I'd have increased heat in the case. So Gen 3, Gen 4 PCIe spec will be absolutely fine. Obviously Gen 3, you can get some really good value SSDs. And even that uplift from Gen 3 to Gen 4 in terms of sim racing performance will be fairly minimal. So, you know, if your budget can stretch to it, Gen 4 is going to be great. I run a Samsung 970 Pro 2 terabyte. The performance has been phenomenal. The prior drive that I run, which is in my system as a second hard drive, was the prior generation Samsung. I think it was an 870 Evo Plus, can't quite remember the name, but even that drive still runs fantastically well. So try not to keep an eye on Gen 5, because if you go that route, then make sure you're going that route because you're a content creator or you're moving significant file sizes around. Otherwise, Gen 4, Gen 3, PCIe, great value, great performance, and then really all you've got to make a decision on is just the size of the drive. What I've noticed is to get the max performance from some of the Gen 4 drives, 2 terabytes is sometimes required. But again, the difference between that max performance versus the 90 to 95% you get if it's a 1 terabyte or a 500 gigabyte drive is going to be minimal. So pick the size that you need for the system that you run. And as I said, just be aware that the PCIe Gen 5 SSDs probably aren't going to be needed for your system, especially if it's purely for gaming or just for sim racing. Power supply is an interesting component. It's not often one that you think about initially. There's nothing really enthusiastic about a power supply, there's nothing to get that excited about, but it is really the cornerstone of your system. And it's also one of the key things that if you get a good and strong power supply with sufficient wattage, it can carry you through multiple upgrade cycles. I think the power supply I've got in my system is probably 4 years old. It's probably been through, I think, the 2 builds that I've had. I did upgrade it once because my first power supply was an 850 watt, and then I moved to a 1000 watt power supply when I got the 4090. Now, of course, if I'd started with 1000 watt, then I wouldn't have needed to upgrade it at all. So, of course, more watts, more power, more money to spend. You only need the amount of watts to power the current system that you have. But if you do get a little bit of headroom, of course, that can help for future upgradability. And while CPUs are becoming almost more efficient for the same power draw and the same performance, the same can't be said for GPUs. We fully expect the next iteration of NVIDIA graphics cards to push up those power requirements again. I think, you know, if I go 5090, I'll just about be okay with a 1000 watt power supply, but I'll probably be on the limit. So you don't want to skimp too much on here, but my advice is pretty simple. Put all of your components into PC Part Picker. That will give you a pretty decent estimate of the power draw for your system, and then try and build in a little bit of headroom. You don't want to match those two numbers. You know, if it comes back with a power draw of 600, then maybe an 850 watt power supply is going to be a nice balance. If the power draw is, you know, 800, then maybe you're going to need to look towards a 1000 watt power supply. There's not many systems today that would need you to go above a 1000 watt power supply. You know, 1200, 1400 PSUs are available. Again, almost exclusively for overclocking, or, you know, if you have a specific use case that draws a lot of power from your components, then you'll already know. But a 1000 watt power supply, you can get those sort of reasonable, good value for money, I think, today. There's a bunch of different suppliers out there. The key thing is just do your research on the manufacturer, make sure the quality of the power supply is right up there. High quality components is going to help that power supply last in the long term. So it's not just about having the watts and the headroom, it's also about getting the right quality. There's a bit of a standard that's out there. I think it's bronze, silver, gold, maybe platinum as well. I've always just gone for the bronze power supply. It's been absolutely fine, to be honest. And again, if you go up that grading system and get into the gold or platinum, then of course you'll spend more money, but I'm not convinced there's a huge amount of benefit. But do the research, make sure you've got watts, a little bit of headroom, and that there's good reviews on the quality of the brand of power supply that you're buying. So that's going to be it for this one. Hopefully there's a few tidbits in there, whether you're looking to buy your next pre-built or about to buy a whole bunch of components and do a do-it-yourself build, something that I do love to do every couple of years. One thing I didn't mention, but really important, is once you've got everything set up, running, you're starting to kind of sim race for the first time on the new build. It's really great in the first month or so, or at least the first couple of weeks, to have a hardware monitoring program like HW Info, and there are others out there, just to make sure that your system is performing as you expect. RAM speeds, CPU clocks, are you temperature throttled in either CPU or GPU? There's nothing worse than investing time and money into a system and then finding out 6 months later that there's some component in your system that's kind of letting you down and is just throttling performance for whatever reason. So as I said, I use HW Info, and I don't run it all the time because of course that is a performance draw as well. But every time I do a new build, it is a program that I like to run through a couple of races just so I can look back, check the temperatures and make sure everything is performing as expected. Next video will be on stuttering, something that I spend too much time looking into. I haven't had any major issues with that recently, but over the past couple of years there's been a number of times when I've kind of gone into that rabbit hole to try and figure out what might be causing a stutter, and I've got a whole bunch of different avenues that are worth looking at. So hopefully I'll have that out in the next 2 weeks and you find it useful. But until then, thank you for tuning in, and I'll catch you in the next one.